What is going on, everybody? My name is Michael Levan. Thank you so much for joining me today. And what we are going to be discussing is how Kubernetes comes misconfigured for security out of the box. Now, there's a hefty list, I would say. However, we're going to talk about the key things that you can really look into when you're spinning up your first Kubernetes cluster in production, whether it's your first or your fifth or your 100th. These tips are definitely going to help get your Kubernetes environment up to snuff when it comes to security. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. So let's talk about how Kubernetes is misconfigured out of the box. Now, this is going to be a general overview, but something that you should definitely keep an eye out for is we're going to have a video coming out on the Kubernetes OWASP top 10, and that's going to go into a little bit more detail than this, and it's also going to point you into some different directions into how you can think about what OWASP top 10 thinks about Kubernetes and about what you can do from a security standpoint when it comes to OWASP. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, first things first, this whole admin context. Now, when you think about like Linux, for example, or even Windows servers or Windows desktops, you have a general user that gets created usually, and you have a root or admin user that gets created usually. So these are like the two that are created by default. But with Kubernetes, you have this general context, which is like in your kube config, and it just has access to everything. Like that first general Kubernetes context, it has access to everything. So the kube config, we should really think about a way to have a root one because it's needed, but also right afterwards create a context or, RBAC permissions, whatever you want to do to make sure that, you're not just giving everybody this admin context. Because, if you're a root user, for example, in Azure, and let's say you're creating an Azure Kubernetes service cluster, when you run the AZ get -credentials command against your Kubernetes cluster, and if you're an admin in Azure, you're going to get this admin context that gets configured for you inside of your kube config on your local host. Again, when you run this AZ AKS get credentials command, and that's not good. You should really be thinking about a way to, okay, let me actually create RBAC permissions here so I can give myself an appropriate context that isn't root to all. Next, there's the default namespace. So by default, I'm going to try to not say this 10 times fast. By default, the default namespace is used when deploying pods by default. So if you don't specify in your Kubernetes manifest where you want your pods to go, they go to the default namespace. And that's not great because you want essentially everything to have its own namespace. That way you can create certain permissions, segregations, and regulations based on what your internal security needs are for each namespace, and in turn for each application running inside of that namespace. Next, public endpoints. I feel like I've said this a few times in different content, but I think it's very crucial. I read a blog post maybe a few months back or so that showed that over 900,000 Kubernetes clusters, the control planes, were exposed. Now, this could be general control planes that have public IP addresses associated to them, or it could be like a load balancer that has a public IP or a public DNS associated to it that was sitting in front of multiple control planes. So the first thing that you want to ensure is that your Kubernetes clusters, or your control planes rather, don't have public IP addresses associated to them. Good old RBAC. Now, RBAC is fun for every organization in every way, shape, and form, but from a Kubernetes perspective, it's typically a mess. So when you're designing what users are going to have access, when you're designing what services are going to have access, for example, let's say you're defining a service account to use to deploy certain pods, you want to make sure that you specify your cluster roles, your cluster role permissions, your cluster role bindings, and ensure that everything that you want is attached to a specific service account with least privilege in mind. Don't start with full admin. Start with the very, very minimum, and if more is needed, add as you go. Communication inside of the Kubernetes cluster. Now, we're not going to get into CNIs and Kubernetes proxies and all of this good stuff, but what we will talk about is pod-to-pod communication, service-to-service communication, sometimes called east-west traffic. Now, by default, these are not encrypted. So you essentially have a few options: network policies that you can set up, service meshes, or you can use a specific CNI like Calico that is security centric, that gives you the ability to do a little bit of encryption between pods. Kubernetes secrets is a huge one, and there's a big reason why a lot of organizations use an outside secrets manager like HashiCorp Vault, for example, because the OPAC standard by default inside of your Kubernetes cluster is not encrypted, meaning when you create a secret and you store it inside of Kubernetes using the OPAC default, it is stored in plain text. Now, here's another big thing that, it definitely needs to be thought about. When you create a Kubernetes secret, there are essentially two ways: via the command line, which you pass in the value on the command line, or you pass in some type of text file with the value, or you create a Kubernetes manifest with the value in it. Now, with that, either way, you're passing in plain text values. You need to save those values somewhere. So if you're creating a Kubernetes manifest, you're going to have to save it to, I don't know, source control. And that source control is going to be public. Whether it's a private repository or not, it's going to be plain text. Those secrets are going to be plain text for whoever has access to see, whether it's, again, a public repo or a private repo, and it's going to be sitting in plain text. And that's not good, which is why a lot of people are using a third-party solution like HashiCorp Vault. Finally, the default service account. So when you're creating pods, right, like in your Kubernetes manifest, if you don't specify a service account, the default service account, so the one that's created by default in Kubernetes, is used. Now, what does that mean? Well, number one, that service account has literally access to everything. So if you deploy 100 applications with that service account and they're tied to that service account, and that service account gets compromised, guess what? So did the rest of your environment. So you always want to make sure that you're creating a service account to deploy pods with proper RBAC permissions. And with that, that's going to bring us to the end of this video. Again, make sure you check out the video coming up for OWASP Top 10. We're going to be diving into a lot of these topics way more, and you're going to see where the OWASP Top 10 lives and how you can get started with it today. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you again next time.